Hey guys, so this video is walking you guys through some very basic concepts here. You guys have already talked a lot about the literary analysis elements, but I'm going to kind of walk you through some of these major points of a short story. And the first one we're looking at this week is plot and conflict. So plot is basically looking beyond what happens in the story. A lot of times when people do literary analysis, they simply recap what happens. And that is a summary rather than an analysis. So to look at plot beyond just what happens, we have to think about it in terms of the narrative arc. And you guys have probably encountered this many times before in middle school, high school, college. You guys are looking at what is basically called Freytag's pyramid when you understand plot development. So when you have a plot developed, you have generally these specific 5 parts. You have an exposition, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and a denouement or a resolution. And I'm going to kind of walk you guys through all of these things. Now, typically a story doesn't always look exactly like this. It's not necessarily that the rising action and the falling action have equal weight or even time in the story. It's just you do generally have these 5 parts when you are telling a story. So an exposition is essentially the background. So it's where you set up the characters and therefore you establish the motivation for those characters. This is where you give the setting, any prior events that happened before the start of the story, the history of the characters, whatever it might be that you need to set up that story. If you just launched into a story about your friend and the beginning point was, and then we got cake, that would make no sense to anyone. But if you started with, it was my friend's birthday and we forgot to go get him a cake, so we did X, Y, and Z, that's the exposition. Rising action is where conflict starts occurring. And this is where you're bringing characters and events together, and you're kind of bringing your story into something that's a bit more eventful and exciting. This is where you build the tension in the narrative. So this is basically usually a very large part of your story. It's where you have all of the things that happen in a story. So if I go back to the cake story, if you said it was my friend's birthday and I forgot to get him a cake, you can't just jump to, it was a massive chocolate cake. There's something missing in there. So you have to explain what happened between the beginning of the story and basically the most exciting point. And if you said, I forgot to get him a cake, so my friend and I decided to run to the store and we bought 6 different kinds of cake mix and 42 kinds of sprinkles. We went home and we decided to bake the cakes. It was a huge mess. And so we threw it all out. That would be the rising action. Then we get to the climax. The climax is the most important point in the story. It's where you have the turning point. And then you say, this is where the conflict usually comes to a point. So if in that same story, you would say, we were panicking and finally my friend, we heard a knock on the door, opened the door, and there was my girlfriend with a giant chocolate cake, beautifully decorated, ready to go. That would be the climax of the story. The falling action is where everything kind of begins to resolve itself after the climax. The characters that have been split kind of come back together, and the resolutions to the problems begin to appear. So for example, you would say in that same story that after this, my friend showed up, he loved the chocolate cake, and he told us he was so excited. And then the resolution and the denouement is really where the conflict is resolved. The characters arrive at some kind of understanding or universal truth. And the story is generally wrapped up with a final moral or lesson. So you say, I'm so glad my friend had a great birthday. I'm glad he loved the cake. Next time, I'll make sure to not forget his birthday and make a cake way ahead of time. That's how you would resolve that story. There are some things that can mess with a traditional plot. So you can have foreshadowing, you can have flashbacks, you can have bookends where you start and end the story at the same point. You can have an unresolved narrative. There are authors who like to do this just to kind of mess with the traditional plot structure. You can have an unreliable narrator. So what they're telling you may not be the truth. So you may not get the full story in the right order in the way that you expect to have it. You can also have dramatic irony, which basically gives you a twist at the end that you didn't see coming. All of these things kind of mess with the traditional plot structure. They're still kind of part of it, but they tend to kind of change it or see what they can do with it that's outside the norm. When we talk about conflict, we kind of gone through this already, but there are 4 kinds of universal conflicts. I want you to note the idea of the universal man here with the capital M. It can be non-gender specific, so it can be man or woman. It could even be animals or inanimate objects. You can have one or more types of conflict in a single narrative, so you're not just having necessarily just one. So the 4 types are man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, and man versus society. So man versus man typically focuses on the conflict between at least 2 people or more. And it can be read through a critical lens. So it can be read through something through like gender dynamics, social dynamics, socioeconomic status differences, cultural dynamics differences, so on. The conflict can be subtle or it can be overt. So it can be named or unnamed. Often it's a protagonist versus an antagonist, but it can be a lot of other things too. The most very obvious example I can give you is Harry versus Voldemort in Harry Potter. That's a straightforward man versus man conflict. There's also man versus self. So this is typically when this is an inherent struggle with oneself. It can be based on sort of an inner or an outer conflict. So it can be a question of who am I, or who am I in this sort of larger world. It can be fighting one's demons, or it can be struggling to find one's place. Generally speaking, it's typically related to larger cultural struggles, universal experiences. Artistic movements can be very influential on stories that feature man versus self, and so on. So a good example of this, if you've ever read The Call of the Wild, the story is of a dog who basically gets stolen and sold off to traders who use him as a work dog. And he's torn between being this domesticated animal and sort of these inherent calls to go be free and be wild and be in nature and be sort of more savage and more undomesticated. So that really is a typical, really prominent example of man versus self. Man versus nature typically pits man against the elements, so usually for survival. These are often really harsh environments that man must survive, or sometimes they don't survive it, but they're trying to. Typically, this demonstrates the power of nature as an unstoppable, untamable force. Man is generally trying to tame or outsmart nature in these cases. And a lot of times cultural or historical context can be important here. So for example, To Build a Fire by Jack London takes place during the Gold Rush. And there's a particular trail that Gold Rush experts would take. And there was a trail that they knew not to take. And this guy comes and he tries to take the other trail because he's a newbie. He doesn't know. And he gets lost and basically has to try and build a fire to survive the night because of the elements, the wilderness, the cold, the wolves that come at him. And it's a lesson in basically understanding your history and understanding what you should and shouldn't do and knowing that you cannot beat nature. And then man versus society is typically man attempting to fight a system of oppression. Generally, it's usually situated historically in the present or in a future society. So this is where a lot of the dystopian society, sci-fi young adult novels that are out currently kind of end up. So it often brings in questions of fair treatment, ethics, law, social norms, social codes, and it's focused on understanding one's place in society, or sometimes it's understanding how to challenge that place in society. So, for example, Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games is a direct representation of fighting the system or fighting this larger social norms or social structures. You could also argue that she represents man versus man against Snow. So there's a lot of different conflicts that you can see in different narratives, and hopefully that gives you guys a good understanding of how these conflicts and this plot structures go beyond just what is happening in the